WWE has built its empire on the back of legends, and sometimes it turns around and trashes them. Here are 10 times WWE disrespected wrestling legends. At number 10, it's the exploitation of Brian Pillman's death. In October 1997, one of the most unique and talented wrestlers of his generation suddenly passed away in his hotel room just hours before he was scheduled to wrestle on pay-per-view. Pillman was only 35 years old. An autopsy later revealed the cause of death to be a heart attack brought on by undiagnosed heart disease. The very next night on Raw, Vince McMahon brought Pillman's grieving widow Melanie on live TV. Instead of showing compassion, he asked her blunt questions about his history of drug use, as if that might explain his death. At the time, the WWF was desperate for ratings, and this was the one line that they chose to cross. The segment was seen as tasteless and exploitative, and it left Melanie Pillman scarred for years afterwards. Brian deserved better than to have his memory disrespected in this way by Vince McMahon. At number 9, it's the continued disrespect of the Macho Man. By 1994, Randy Savage was still one of the biggest stars in WWF history, but instead of letting him finish his career in the ring, Vince McMahon put him behind the commentary desk. Savage was furious at Vince for essentially telling him that his wrestling days were over, because he still had plenty to give in the ring. The Macho Man was a born performer, and having to wear the headset was like a slap in the face. It wasn't long before he went to WCW and continued his in-ring career, but from then on, the WWF acted like he didn't exist. For a decade and a half, one of their greatest ever superstars was basically blacklisted. It wasn't until after he died that WWE finally put him in the Hall of Fame. For fans, it was too little too late. A legend like the Macho Man should have been celebrated while he was still here to see it. At number 8, it's WWE using Eddie Guerrero's death as part of a storyline. In November 2005, Eddie was found dead in his hotel room at just 38 years old. He was one of the most popular wrestlers of his era, and his sudden passing left the wrestling world in shock. So fans could not believe what they were seeing when just weeks later, Eddie's name was dragged back onto TV, not in tribute, but as part of a storyline. His lowrider was wheeled out and destroyed on SmackDown. Rey Mysterio's push was built around doing it for Eddie, but booked in a way that made him look weak. And most infamously, Randy Orton sneered that Eddie was in hell to get cheap heat. Instead of honouring one of their most beloved superstars, WWE turned his death into exploitation. It went down as one of the most tasteless uses of a dead wrestler in WWE history, and it left a permanent stain on how the company handled Eddie's legacy. At number 7, it's WWE disrespecting CM Punk's body, and then his wedding day. Punk was one of the most popular guys on the roster back in 2013, fresh off a record-setting WWE title reign. But behind the scenes, he was burned out and growing frustrated with the way the company was being run. WWE's doctors brushed off his injuries, clearing him to perform with a serious staph infection, and even after suffering from concussions, they pushed him to get back into the ring before he was ready, making it clear that the schedule mattered more than his health. And when he finally walked away, WWE mailed him his termination papers on his wedding day. The way it went down left Punk furious. He spent years blasting WWE for how they treated him, and it was almost a decade before he came back to the company. At number 6, it's the WWF turning Hawk's real-life addiction into a storyline. During the Attitude Era, the Legion of Doom were back together on Raw. They were one of the most iconic tag teams in wrestling history, but away from the cameras, Hawk was battling serious problems with alcohol. The WWF decided to turn this into a storyline with Hawk stumbling around like he was drunk and cutting slurred promos. The whole thing came to a head with a stunt where he was pushed off the Titantron. For a man who was genuinely battling addiction, it was a cruel thing to involve him in, and both Hawk and Animal absolutely hated every second of it. At number 5 on our list, it's WWE scapegoating Jim Ross. JR was the voice of the Attitude Era and the greatest living wrestling commentator. By 2013, he wasn't on weekly TV, but he was still a company ambassador, which is why he was tasked with hosting a panel of legends for the WWE 2K14 video game. One of the legends on the panel was Ric Flair, who was going through a difficult period in his life and turned up to the event drunk. Flair rambled on during the panel, visibly intoxicated, but instead of holding him accountable, WWE put the blame on JR. Vince McMahon fired him for not being able to control Flair, but plenty of people believed that he'd been looking for any excuse to get rid of him. The Nature Boy faced no punishment whatsoever, while one of the most loyal people in the company was cast aside. At number 4, it's when the WWF disrespected 3 legends all at once. By this point in 1996, WCW had been raiding Vince McMahon's roster, signing away huge names like Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage. No doubt the WWF was in a tough spot as Monday Nitro started to overtake them in the ratings, and as Vince was backed against the wall, he decided to lash out. What followed were the Billionaire Ted skits, starring parody versions of Hogan, Savage and Mean Gene, along with Ted Turner himself. Week after week, these legends were portrayed as being washed up and pathetic. It was a blatant show of disrespect for the men who carried the WWF through the golden era, but in the end, it didn't hurt the legends at all. It just made Vince and the WWF feel small time in comparison to WCW. At number 3 on the list, it's the WWF making Vader humiliate himself on live TV. Vader came into the Federation off the back of massive runs in WCW in Japan, where he was one of the most feared big men in the business. Fans expected a main event monster, but his WWF run quickly turned into something very different. He was meant to beat HBK for the WWF title, but after their match at SummerSlam, Shawn decided he didn't like working with him. Vince wasn't happy with him either, as he saw him as being too overweight. From there, it all went quickly downhill, bottoming out in 1998, where he was made to cut a promo calling himself a fat piece of shit on live TV. For someone who'd built a reputation as being a dominant force everywhere he wrestled, being told to mock himself after being squashed was nothing short of degrading. At number 2, it's WWE firing Kurt Angle during a global pandemic. By 2020, Kurt had wrapped up his in-ring career and entered the Hall of Fame as a certified legend. He was working backstage as an agent and was still making the odd TV appearance when the COVID-19 pandemic started. WWE decided to cut him as part of their pandemic budget releases. On paper, it was a cost-saving move, but the company was still highly profitable and had even been declared an essential business to keep shows running. Kurt was released in a wave of about 20 other staff members, cast aside as if he was nothing. The only Olympic gold medalist in WWE history was discarded like trash for no good reason. And at number 1 on our list, it's the ultimate disrespect of the Ultimate Warrior. In the late 80s and early 90s, Warrior was one of the biggest stars in wrestling, a former WWF champion who beat Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania. But by 2005, his relationship with the company had completely fallen apart. That year, WWE put together a DVD about his career, and when Warrior refused to take part, they went ahead without him. What resulted was the self-destruction of the Ultimate Warrior, a corporate hit piece that spent almost 2 hours mocking him. Every interview buried his promos, his work and his attitude, with barely a positive word said about him. It was a total character assassination, and for one of the biggest stars of the golden era, it was pure disrespect. For more lists full of wrestling outrage, click the playlist on the screen right now.